What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Welcome to part 2 of our two-part episode on the dancer, innovator, and visionary Loïe Fuller. In part 1, we explored Loïe's upbringing in Chicago, her devastating marriage to Colonel William Hayes, and her eventual rise to fame in the American theater world. We then explored the creation of Loïe's serpentine dance, her move to Paris where she became a sensation, and her ingenious use of lighting and costumes in her performances. We left things off in our story just as Loïe embarked on a new and daring project, her own feminist interpretation of the biblical story of Salome. The story of Salome comes from the New Testament. As the story goes, Salome seductively dances for King Herod, who in return offers to grant her anything she desires. Salome's one ask is for the head of Saint John the Baptist, whose decapitated head is soon after delivered to her on a platter. Subsequently, Salome has most commonly been characterized as a femme fatale and seductress. But for her own rendition of Salome, Loïe presents a very different character. In Loïe's version, Salome is actually a follower of Saint John the Baptist, and when she catches King Herod's attention, Salome even turns to Saint John for protection. Despite King Herod's continuous attempts to seduce Salome, she remains chaste and steadfast in her devotion to the saint. Sick with jealousy, it is not Salome, but King Herod who calls for the head of Saint John the Baptist. It is only then that Salome decides to dance for the king, as a last-ditch effort to save her beloved saint. In a tragic final act, as Salome dances with all her might, she hears the devastating news that Saint John has been beheaded, and that her desperate pleas to save his life have come too late. Loïe began preparing her production of Salome in the winter of 1894, choreographing 5 never-before-seen dances, designing new costumes and lighting techniques, and carefully crafting her narrative. Up until this point, Loïe's performances had almost entirely been devoid of any storyline, instead focusing on mesmerizing visual effects. By now telling a story, Loïe hoped to elevate her status as both a performer and creative. Loïe took great efforts to make her version of Salome as historically accurate as possible. She studied the history of dance at the Bibliothèque Nationale, so she could recreate dances from biblical times. As Loïe explained, "I have only revived a forgotten act, for I have been able to trace some of my dances back to 4,000 years ago." She commissioned the painter Georges Rocher-Gras to design the sets and costumes, and she hired her own team of electricians to help enhance the production's stage and lighting design. And though Loïe oversaw nearly every aspect of the show's production, she still made time to prepare for the role of Salome, which she would play herself. One critic was fortunate enough to get a sneak peek of Loïe's performance, as he exclaimed, "Loïe Fuller is known to almost everybody as the clever skirt dancer, but few know Loïe Fuller as an artist, a great artist, such as she will reveal herself to the public. As I saw her on the stage of this little theater, just sufficiently lighted to see the expressions of her face. It seemed scarcely believable that this small figure, in her ordinary dark walking dress, without the aid of lights or stage accessories, with no spoken word, could move us to the extent that she did. Loïe's rendition of Salome officially premiered at La Comédie Parisienne in March of 1895. Unfortunately, initial reviews were mixed at best, and Loïe received a lot of backlash over her performance. But what's even more tragic is that the majority of the criticism had less to do with Loïe's skills as a performer and more to do with her appearance. Now in her mid-30s, Loïe had noticeably put on weight. But whereas in her serpentine dance she could hide behind layers of fabric, as Salome, Loïe's body was more exposed. As author Rhonda Garelick explained, Fuller was already known for her dazzling self-transformations on stage. As Salome, though, she failed to perform her usual transubstantiation. Instead of disappearing into enormous floating lengths of fabric in every scene, as Salome, Fuller frequently permitted spectators to see her actual body dancing, without benefit of outsized veils or elaborate stagecraft and lighting. It was too close for comfort. Loïe was body-shamed all over the press, some reviews even mocking her for being too sweaty. Quite ironically, in Loïe's attempt to break Salome free from female stereotypes and misogyny, Loïe herself fell victim to those same limitations. Because the production as a whole was not nearly as successful as Loïe had hoped, she decided to repurpose several of the dances she created for Salome as independent pieces. Extracted from the story, these individual dances received much better reception. The most popular of these dances was the fire dance, in which she manipulated silk fabric with colored underlighting to create the illusion that she was on fire. As a critic once described, in the fire dance, Loïe appeared turning and twisting in a torrent of incandescent lava. Her long tunic leaps about in the flames, curled in burning spirals, undulating and whirling. It suddenly explodes and then wilts slowly into a red blaze. Though Salome had been a professional disappointment, the fire dance clearly reignited public interest in Loïe. After a successful few weeks in Paris, Loïe went on to present her new dances in England and later in America, where she toured in the early months of 1896. Though the last time Loïe returned to her home country had been a disappointment, this time American audiences couldn't get enough of her performances, and her shows quickly sold out. Loïe performed in many major cities, including New York and Philadelphia, and even made it as far as Mexico City. After each performance, she received standing ovations and calls for an encore. As a spectator of one of her performances in New York recalled, "The curtain fell, the lights went up, and the theater broke loose, flowers galore." After numerous recalls, Miss Fuller came forward, kissed her hands to the audience, and executed a peculiar convulsive spasm of her whole frame, expressive of her widely affectionate emotion upon her reception. She came forward again, and in answer to all who yelled "Speech," she said, "With all my heart, I thank you," accompanying each word with another convulsive expression of emotion. Loïe returned to Paris in 1897, where she continued to perform her new dances at the Folies Bergère. Soon, she not only bounced back from her failed rendition of Salome, but she began to be regarded as more than just a performer. Many artists of her time started to welcome Loïe into their artistic circles and saw her as an artist in her own right. As one critic declared, "La Loïe Fuller, the very name evokes the ideal that reality denies us. With her, art itself finds a place on the stage. Miss Loïe, your magic originality is both poetry and dance." In fact, Loïe became so admired in artistic circles that she was quickly dubbed the Queen of Art Nouveau, the new decorative artistic style burgeoning in Paris at the time. Loïe's ties to Art Nouveau were partially a result of chance. Her rise to fame almost exactly coincided with the creation of Art Nouveau. And more than this, she shared with the movement an interest in nature, color, and sinuous motion. Loïe's dances, which transformed her into fire, flowers, and butterflies, perfectly embodied the movement's fascination with natural form, and her innovative stage lighting echoed the movement's preference for vivid color and abstraction. But it wasn't just her performances that made Loïe a leading figure of Art Nouveau. By the turn of the century, Loïe was flooded with so many requests from artists to capture her portrait that she also became the face of the movement. Loïe inspired hundreds of different works across the mediums, making her one of the most frequently depicted women of modern history. Today, historians have identified at least 70 different artists from 10 different countries who captured Loïe's likeness across a variety of mediums, from sculpture to posters to ceramics and even to functional objects like lamps. In fact, Loïe was depicted so many times that scholars still cannot determine the exact number of works that she inspired. Unfortunately, there are too many of these works for us to explore in today's episode, but we will dive into a few of the most remarkable portraits of Loïe from this period. Perhaps the most regarded depictions of Loïe were done by the French artist Raoul François Larche, who produced a number of bronze statuettes of her. In one, titled The Dancer, Larche depicts Loïe in mid-motion, her swirling fabrics billowing over her head like stormy clouds. As the MoMA website describes, here Larche sculpts Fuller as an almost goddess-like figure, commanding waves of fabric that fly weightlessly above her head and around her little body. Larche also created at least 4 different variations of lamps of Loïe. In one of his better-known ones, Loïe balances undulating fabric as it rises sinuously over her head. With her arms outstretched, Loïe almost likens a bird, balancing her wings as she soars through tempestuous skies. Larche then inserted 2 light bulbs within the sculpted fabric, hiding the wire within the lamp's interior. As the Charles Hosmer Museum of American Art describes, in Larche's lamp, electricity and Fuller are fused together, just as they were in her dramatic performances. Loïe was also photographed by some of the most prominent photographers of her day. In 1900, the British photographer Samuel Joshua Beckett photographed Loïe dancing in a series of 13 portraits. But instead of performing on the stage, here Beckett has captured Loïe dancing amongst nature in a park. Wrapped in yards of white fabric, in these photographs, Loïe twirls, leaps, and gallops between luscious trees as a glowing light pours in from the sky. Like an angel dancing in the heavens, Loïe feels otherworldly and ethereal, accentuated by her free-flowing white gown. Loïe was photographed again that same year by the sculptor Rodin's personal photographer, Eugène Drouet. Rodin himself commissioned the photographs of Loïe as studies for a sculpture he planned to make of her. While unfortunately this sculpture was never fully realized, Drouet's portraits of Loïe are nothing short of magical. In one, Loïe stands in full costume, staring at the viewer directly. The white fabric, which envelops Loïe's entire body, billows onto the floor like puddles of water. On her shoulders, Loïe wears 2 wings, which extend well above her head, making her feel small in comparison. In Drouet's photographs, Loïe's own body melds with the fabric she wears, turning her into a mystical creature. And Loïe was captured in ceramics as well. Some of the most extraordinary of these pieces are from a series of stoneware dishes made by the French ceramicist Clément Messier. In these dishes, Loïe is engraved at the center, moving her arms in a swirling upwards motion. She is surrounded by spiraling lines of colors, blues, oranges, yellows, pinks, and purple, which circle around Loïe like clouds in a storm. Although two-dimensional, these plates burst with action and energy and create the impression that Loïe is actually moving. Loïe inspired a number of works in glass as well, including works by Louis Comfort Tiffany, who incorporated Loïe's likeness in a series of glass lamps. And even if Loïe's own image was not used for certain works, the impact of her ingenious performances could certainly still be felt. As the glassmaker Émile Gallé once said, "I was led to seek new colorings by seeing the beautiful light effects invented by Loïe Fuller." And soon Loïe's immense influence on Art Nouveau would be on full display at Paris's upcoming Universal exhibition. In 1900, Paris hosted the famous World Fair, and Art Nouveau was at its center. Loïe's imprint on the movement could be felt throughout the entirety of the exhibition. Not only did many of the works on display feature Loïe's image, but she was also given her very own pavilion, where she could put on special performances. Her pavilion was designed by the French artist Pierre Roche, who sculpted Loïe's image onto the building's facade. Loïe also commissioned the Italian artist Manuel Arazzi to create a custom poster advertising her pavilion. And to enhance her performance, Loïe partnered with the Japanese performer Sada Yako, who opened for Loïe's main act. Sada Yako was a geisha, actress, and dancer who performed scenes from kabuki, Japan's classical theater tradition. Yako was extremely talented, and in fact she became so popular that she went on to become one of Japan's first international celebrities. Loïe was one of the first to recognize Yako's unique talents, and her inclusion in Loïe's pavilion jump-started Yako's career in Europe. As Loïe once described, "I turned Sada Yako loose. Give you my word, I never saw anything like the way those critics went wild with enthusiasm. It was almost too good to be true." Sada Yako wasn't a success. She was a fervor. Paris was mad about her. But as always, Loïe was the main star. Eager guests clamored to get tickets to her pavilion, and Loïe's performances sold out almost instantly. As authors Richard and Marcia Current wrote, Loïe's Palace of Electricity was the active soul of the exhibition, and poured forth the magical, mysterious fluid that gave light and life to the entire show. Here was the fluid energy that seemed synonymous with the flowing dynamic of Loïe's dances. In sum, Loïe enjoyed a double triumph at the exposition, her theater becoming memorable both as a prime expression of avant-garde art and as the scene of the most original and artistic entertainment. And as a contemporary critic raved, "An effigy of Loïe Fuller whirling under the projectors should have crowned the fair's entrance." Her quality of movement could be found in all the truly modern parts of the exhibition. Loïe Fuller seemed to epitomize the spirit of the exhibition. Loïe must have felt on top of the world. Not only was the exposition successful, but it solidified her as a leading artist in Paris. And with her success would come new acquaintances that would forever change the course of her life, for better or for worse. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. It was also in the year 1900 that Loïe would meet the woman who would become her lifelong romantic partner. Gabrielle Bloch, who went by Gab, was from a wealthy French Jewish family. She was an introverted and intense young woman. Well ahead of her time, Gab was mask presenting and dressed almost exclusively in men's suits, a decision that certainly turned heads. Loïe officially met Gab in 1898 through Gab's cousin, Roger Marks, who was one of Loïe's biggest supporters. But Gab had been well aware of Loïe long before then, and had first fallen in love with her years prior after seeing one of her performances. As Gab once wrote of Loïe, "Soul of the flowers, soul of the sky, soul of flame, Loïe Fuller has given them to us. She has created the soul of the dance, for until Loïe Fuller came, the dance was without soul." So we can only imagine how starstruck Gab must have been to officially meet her idol. This was exasperated when Loïe gave her a parting gift, a signed photograph of herself with the words, "To my dear little friend." It took the shy and withdrawn Gab 2 full years to approach Loïe about a romantic relationship. For these first 2 years, Gab harbored her growing feelings for Loïe secretly, and the two remained strictly friends. Not only was Loïe one of the most famous women in all of Paris, but she was also 14 years Gab's elder. Fortunately for Gab, her feelings for Loïe were not unrequited, and she and Loïe entered a romantic relationship shortly after the Paris Exposition. It was from this time onwards that Gab lived with Loïe, and she also traveled and toured with Loïe around the world. Considering that queer relationships were hardly accepted in their time, it's nothing short of remarkable how open and unabashed Loïe and Gab were about their romantic partnership, especially given that Loïe was a public figure. It must have taken an immense amount of bravery on both of their parts to share their love so forthrightly. And what's even more remarkable is how their relationship seemed to remain relatively under the radar. Though Loïe in no way hid the fact that she was with a woman, the public and press seemed to pay little attention to Loïe's sexuality. Some recent scholars have suggested a correlation between the lack of attention on Loïe's queerness and the way in which she covered her body on stage. As author Rhonda Gorelick proposed, perhaps Loïe's queerness, with her covered body on stage, meant that she never sexualized herself. She avoided scandal, and she was even described as chaste. And Loïe's sexuality was not only overlooked in her own lifetime. Many historians over the decades have misclassified Loïe's and Gab's relationship as platonic. This is largely due to the fact that many queer relationships throughout history have been misidentified due to internalized homophobia. As author Rhonda Gorelick continued, their relationship fits into a broader historical pattern in which queer women's partnerships were often framed publicly as companionships or artistic collaborations. It was only recently that scholars have re-examined Loïe's relationship with Gab, and all almost unanimously agree that Loïe and Gab were romantic partners. But Gab was much more than just Loïe's lover. As their relationship progressed, Gab quickly began to manage Loïe's career and finances as well. She booked all of Loïe's tours, negotiated Loïe's contracts, and took charge of Loïe's financial and legal affairs, including getting many of her inventions patented. In many ways, Gab was the perfect ambassador for Loïe. She was French and could understand the French language and customs much better than Loïe. And because she came from a privileged background and had an extensive education, she was both multilingual and proficient in accounting. But most of all, she allowed Loïe the space to solely focus on her own creative process, without having to worry about any logistics. Gab would remain Loïe's devoted lover, partner, and manager for the rest of Loïe's life. It was also in the year 1900 that Loïe first met another influential woman in her life, the young, aspiring American dancer, Isadora Duncan. But unfortunately, Loïe's relationship with Isadora Duncan would not nearly be as mutually loving and respectful. Isadora had arrived in Paris in 1900, just in time to see Loïe's pavilion at the exposition. She had never before seen anything as magical as Loïe's performances, and Loïe left a deep impact on her. As Isadora exclaimed, "What an extraordinary genius! That wonderful creature!" She became fluid, she became light, she became every color and flame, and finally, she resolved into miraculous spirals of flames, wafted towards the infinite. Loïe was officially introduced to Isadora shortly after, who put on a private performance for Loïe to show off her own skills as a dancer. It seems that Loïe was equally impressed with Isadora. As Loïe recalled, "She danced with remarkable grace, and she bade fair to become somebody." Loïe immediately invited Isadora to join her on her European tour, and suggested that they meet in Berlin in a few days' time. Isadora excitedly accepted the invitation, but when she arrived in Berlin, she was quickly disillusioned with Loïe. Isadora was shocked to see how openly Loïe and Gab expressed affection for one another. And more than this, that Loïe seemed to have a flock of women surrounding her at all times. As Isadora later described, "A dozen or so beautiful girls crowded around her, alternatively stroking her hands and kissing her." Whether uncomfortable with Loïe's queerness or her devoted troupe of female admirers, Isadora immediately began to have second thoughts about joining Loïe on her tour. Unaware of Isadora's hesitations, Loïe welcomed Isadora with open arms, and even hosted a party on her behalf to introduce her to important theater managers and critics. So when Isadora abruptly up and left Loïe for another opportunity in Vienna, Loïe was left utterly shocked and confused. She frantically telephoned Isadora to see if she was coming back, but Isadora rudely replied, "Only if you deposit to my credit 10,000 francs before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Clearly, this was Isadora's way of making clear that she had moved on, and worse, that it was Loïe who should be indebted to her. And if this wasn't hurtful enough, Loïe found out that Isadora had booked her gig in Vienna through Loïe's own connections. Isadora would never work with Loïe again. Instead, she would become Loïe's arch-rival and biggest competitor in Paris for decades to come. It was around this same time that Loïe began a tumultuous friendship with another important figure of history, the sculptor Auguste Rodin. Rodin was one of Loïe's artistic idols, so she was thrilled to learn that he was also a great admirer of her own work. It didn't take long for Loïe and Rodin to become fast friends, and she became a frequent guest at his studio in Meudon. So when in 1903 Loïe was planning to tour across America, she wanted to take the opportunity to introduce Rodin's work to the American public. Over the first few years of their friendship, Loïe had amassed a small collection of Rodin's work for herself, but she wanted to bring additional works with her to show collectors and institutions. Before her trip, Loïe arranged to loan additional works from Rodin's studio to bring with her to New York. When she arrived that spring, Loïe arranged an exhibition at the National Arts Club in New York, in which she exhibited several of Rodin's works. Unfortunately, Loïe's fatal mistake was exhibiting these works alongside a number of portraits of herself. The resulting effect was that rather than an exhibition to introduce and promote the work of Rodin, the show was seen as, quote, "an exhibition of statuary and paintings of and belonging to Miss Loïe Fuller," with Loïe herself at the center. To make matters worse, Rodin's work was not even labeled with his name. When Rodin got word of the exhibition from friends in New York, he was furious to hear that Loïe had barely given him any recognition. Oblivious to his frustrations, after her exhibition closed, Loïe reached out to the Metropolitan Museum, which was interested in exhibiting Rodin's sculptures for the next year. She excitedly wrote to Rodin with the news, asking not only to keep his works on loan, but for him to send additional works to New York for the Met to exhibit. But Loïe was shocked when Rodin curtly wrote back, "Don't accept. Return everything at once." Though careless in how she arranged her exhibition at the National Arts Club, Loïe was genuine in her desire to promote Rodin's work. She couldn't understand why he would turn down such a great opportunity. As Loïe protested in a letter to Rodin, "I am sorry, because I think that, with the influential friends I have here, Pierpont Morgan has just returned, and I would like to see him about it. But I can't even show him the model, since I have sent it back to you. I am quite miserable, my heart broken, all my efforts for nothing." In an act of protest, Loïe did not return all of Rodin's works, keeping 5 in New York to exhibit at the Met, including a bronze version of his famous statue, The Thinker. Loïe did offer to pay Rodin for these works in the meantime, confident that they would end up in prominent American collections. But because Loïe did not have enough money to pay for these works outright, she sent Rodin a check for partial payment and a promissory note for the rest. Unfortunately, when Rodin deposited the check, the payment was returned, and Rodin now owed the bank the check amount plus interest, amounting to nearly 10,000 francs. Furious, Rodin demanded that Loïe return all remaining works of his at once. In response, Loïe sent Rodin one final plea. As she lamented, "Your talent, your works, your friendship, these I have valued with all of my heart as an artist and as a human being, and everything I have done is a result of that." Though Loïe's intentions may have been pure, the damage had been done, and her well-intentioned but poorly executed plan to introduce Rodin's work into American institutions had blown up in her face. As a result, Rodin refused to continue to work with or communicate with Loïe any longer. It would be over 3 years until Rodin would speak to Loïe again. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Fortunately, Loïe had new and exciting projects to distract herself from her riff with Rodin. In 1907, Loïe put on her most ambitious performance to date at Paris's Hippodrome. For the production, Loïe hired over 100 different dancers to perform in 6 individual dances alongside her. This performance was certainly Loïe's most ethereal. Enhanced by light and projected images, Loïe transformed her dancers into lost souls wandering the afterlife. And with projections of clouds, Loïe turned the stage into celestial skies, which enveloped the dancers as they moved across the stage. The resulting effect was magical, and audiences were left in awe. As one critic declared, Loïe Fuller has put into practice her theory of the orchestration of light. With the imagination of an artist, in her 6 scenes she paints pictures by means of light. It was also around this time that Loïe was approached by a popular Parisian publisher to write her own memoir. Though Loïe openly admitted that she was, quote, "not born with literary qualities," she was excited to be able to share some of her most memorable experiences from her nearly 15-year-long career with her fans. As Loïe quipped, "There were certainly interesting people to talk about, so why not write about them?" For the purposes of the book, Loïe decided to concentrate on her years in Paris, titling her book 15 ans de ma vie, or 15 Years of My Life. To promote her book, her publisher arranged for the famed poet Anatole France to write the introduction. As France wrote, "I had seen her, as she had been seen by multitudes from every corner of the globe, on the stage, waving her draperies in the first light, revealing to us a new and dignified type of beauty, She is an artist with a marvelous perception of spiritual values, considerable theory of human knowledge and philosophy of art, and is marvelously intelligent and even more marvelously instinctive. 15 ans de ma vie was officially published in the fall of 1908. Despite joking that she was born without literary skills, Loïe's memoir flew off the shelves, and even the toughest of critics gave it glowing reviews, including Rodin, who had finally forgiven Loïe. As Rodin proudly wrote, "Madame Loïe Fuller, whom I have admired for a number of years, is, to my mind, a woman of genius, with all the resources of talent. Her talent will always be imitated from now on, and her creation will be re-attempted over and over again, for she has created effects and light and background, all the things which will be studied continually, and whose value I have understood." It seems that Loïe's memoir was not only a massive hit with the French public, but finally healed her tumultuous past with Rodin for good. But after 15 years as one of Paris's leading performers, Loïe began to feel the effects of middle age. Though she continued to perform, her waning physical health slowly started to catch up with her. To start, Loïe's eyes suffered significant damage due to years of exposure to bright lights, and she had to wear a veil over her face to protect her eyes from daylight. Though she fortunately never went fully blind, Loïe's eyesight remained compromised for the rest of her life. As she aged, Loïe also began to put on a significant amount of weight, which made moving her body challenging. She even began to have a recurring nightmare in which she was so large that she fell through glass plates. Whether consciously or subconsciously, Loïe was starting to come to terms with the fact that she needed to slow down. So by the end of 1908, Loïe officially decided to transition from performer to teacher, and founded her own dance school called the Ballet Fantastique. Loïe took in girls of all ages as students, and at its peak, she had over 50 students ranging from 5 to 30 years old. Loïe took these girls in as her own. She not only taught them to dance, but provided room and board, and even hired tutors for their education. As Loïe once admitted, "I was born to be a mother, but some strange perversity of fate led me to the motherhood of natural dancing." And Loïe found the experience of teaching to be incredibly rewarding. Affectionately calling her students her muses, Loïe was taken aback by how much she learned from these young girls. As she joked, "I do not teach these children, they teach me." Loïe's girls gave their debut performance in Paris in February of 1909 and were an instant success. As Rodin declared, "Nothing in all antiquity could have been more beautiful." Clearly, Loïe was just as talented as a teacher behind the curtains as she was as a performer center stage. Also in attendance of this performance was Henry Russell, the director of the newly established Boston Opera House. Russell was so impressed by Loïe's stage and lighting design that he invited her to Boston to advise on the Opera House's lighting setup. As incentive, he also offered her students the opportunity to perform at the Opera House as soon as it opened. Eager to return to her home country, Loïe happily accepted and traveled with her troupe of girls to Boston in March of 1909, where Loïe advised on the Opera House's lighting. After a few weeks, Loïe and her girls went on to New York, where they performed at the Metropolitan Opera. As author Rhonda Gorelick described, "For this piece, Fuller positioned 30 girls behind a vast gauze curtain. The girls then danced as projectors played colored lights and scenes of natural landscapes upon the gauze. The troupe's movements coordinated with the screen images, so that the volcano's tongues of flame, for example, seemed animated by waving movements of the dancers behind the screen." The performance received rave reviews, and Loïe's troupe of girls were just as successful in America as they had been in Paris. When Loïe returned to Paris in 1910, she continued to develop her dance academy. Over the next few years, her girls performed at some of Paris's most distinguished theaters. But despite her continued success, Loïe's life would soon be unexpectedly thrown into upheaval, alongside millions of others, with the start of World War I in 1914. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. As soon as the war started, everyday life quickly came to a stall, and with it came the closure of theaters. With Europe now war-torn, Loïe decided to travel back to America with her troupe of girls in 1915. Upon arrival, Loïe made her way out west, settling in San Francisco, where the Panama Pacific International Exposition was being hosted. The Panama Pacific International Exposition was a large-scale exhibition showcasing work from all around the world, and it was the perfect place for Loïe to expose her work to younger American audiences. Loïe and her dance troupe performed at the Panama Pacific International Exposition 4 times over the course of a month. Unsurprisingly, Loïe and her girls were a massive hit and received glowing reviews. As one critic exclaimed, "La Loïe Fuller's appearance last night was a triumph. Before a crowd of 3,500, including the city's foremost art lovers, the world-famous danseuse and her company of girls interpreted musical masterpieces in dance, presenting new creations in color effects, revelry, spirit, and art." Loïe also became involved with curating the exposition's French pavilion and strongly advocated for the inclusion of Rodin's work. She even gave public lectures on Rodin in the hopes of educating American audiences on his work. As Loïe declared in a lecture, "When our day shall belong to the past, when generations have come and generations have gone, the immortal works left by Rodin will remain, and his genius will stand like a giant in the storm, unshaken, unmoved." It was also in San Francisco that Loïe became acquainted with the American philanthropist and patron of the arts, Alma Spreckels. Loïe encouraged Spreckels to start collecting Rodin's work, and liaised between the collector and the artist, brokering several deals on Rodin's behalf. Spreckels would go on to become one of America's most influential art collectors, and would later found the California Palace of the Legion of Honor Museum in 1924. Thanks to Loïe's advice, the museum today has one of the most distinguished collections of Rodin sculpture in all of America. It was also during this time that Loïe was introduced to another important American collector, Samuel Hill. As with Spreckels, Loïe convinced Hill to start acquiring French artists, focusing once again on the work of Rodin. It was largely thanks to Loïe's encouragement that Hill decided to convert his mansion in Cleveland into an art museum, today known as the Mary Hill Museum of Art. Loïe helped facilitate the acquisition of much of the museum's European art collection. In fact, Loïe even donated some of her own personal collection of Rodin's works to the museum. And while the museum was still being built, Loïe gave public lectures on Rodin, as well as other prominent French artists such as Theodore Rivière. The Mary Hill Museum today has over 80 works by Rodin in its permanent collection. And while Loïe was busy helping build American art collections, she also became heavily involved with charity work for Romania, not only raising money for Romania, but also American awareness of the country and its struggles in the war. Loïe had made the acquaintance of Queen Marie of Romania many years earlier while performing in Bucharest. The two women immediately connected over their shared interest in the arts and had remained in touch over the years. When Romania entered the war in 1916, Loïe wrote to Queen Marie offering her assistance. Unfortunately, Romania was almost immediately devastated by the war. In fact, it took less than 24 hours after entering the war for Romania's capital city to become occupied by the enemy. As Queen Marie wrote to Loïe, "By what words can I begin? Such terrible events have fallen on me lately that I stand small before them. With wide open eyes full of tears, oh Loïe, we will want help from all sides." Loïe began to focus all of her efforts on educating the American people on Romania and the devastating effects the war was having on it. In Loïe's own words, she wanted to, quote, "make every American know what Romania is and who the Romanians are." She even wrote a 12-page letter to the First Lady, recounting the horrors that Queen Marie had described in her letters and pleading for American aid. She also organized the American National Committee for Romanian Relief and worked with the Red Cross and the federal government to raise over $700,000 for the cause. But unfortunately, despite Loïe's determined efforts, in the end, she could do little to help save Queen Marie. Within a few months, almost all of Romania was occupied by either German or Bulgarian forces, and Marie was unable to receive the money Loïe had raised. All Loïe could do was wait with bated breath for word that the Queen was safe. But Loïe's concern for the Queen may have been more personal than she let on. Some scholars have speculated that Loïe and the Queen shared romantic interest in one another. Certainly, their letters spanning their long friendship point to this possibility. In these letters, Loïe and the Queen often refer to one another as beloved, and they clearly share a special emotional intimacy. And in fact, their potential romance did not go overlooked in their own lifetimes. A few years later, gossip columns speculated that Loïe and the Queen may be romantically involved, referencing their unusual closeness. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship was, it definitely teetered the line between romantic and platonic. Could Loïe have been in love with the Queen, and the Queen with her? Were Loïe's feelings for the Queen part of her willingness to help save Romania? And did their potential romance make the war all the more unbearable for Loïe? Loïe remained sick with worry until she received the good news in November of 1918 that the war was finally over and that the Allies had won. She returned to Paris the following month, where she not only made contact with the Queen, but was able to see her in person. On her trip to Paris, the Queen was so grateful for Loïe's efforts that she gave Loïe an honorary Romanian uniform. As the Queen gushed to Loïe, "My heart is moved by an immense gratitude mixed with wonder at all the astonishing work you do for me." And as the Queen later remarked, "Some have wondered at the friendship of a queen with a woman whom some would call lowly. That woman is Loïe Fuller. Her name has often been slighted. That woman stood by me when my back was to the wall. That woman gave me life in my hour of need. She went all over America getting aid for my people. I wish there would be no doubt in any heart that that woman gave me hope." It was also during the Queen's visit that Loïe proposed to her an idea for her next big project. Loïe wanted to transform one of the Queen's short stories, The Lily of Life, into a narrative dance. The Lily of Life was a fairy tale that the Queen had written many years earlier for her youngest daughter. The Queen was touched that Loïe wanted to translate her story onto the stage and excitedly gave Loïe her blessing. Loïe immediately set to work on creating original choreography, stage design, and costumes. The Lily of Life officially premiered at the Paris Opera House in July of 1920. On opening night, the show was not only attended by Paris's most prestigious persons, but Queen Marie herself, who beamed with pride as she watched her story transform into a colorful display of dance and movement. As the New York Times reported, last evening, Queen Marie of Romania saw at the opera a fairy tale that she had written, turned into magical reality by the art of Madame Loïe Fuller. It was the most brilliant night that there has been at the opera since before the war. In fact, The Lily of Life was such a success that Loïe decided to turn it into a feature-length film, the first of 3 films that Loïe would go on to make. To translate her vision onto the screen, Loïe won the backing of France's biggest producer, Léon Gaumont, who funded the project and gave Loïe access to his studio, facilities, and equipment. Loïe also teamed up with her romantic partner, Gab, who co-directed the film with her. The film features many of Loïe's original dances, including the Serpentine dance. And where Loïe really shined as a director was in the experimental and innovative cinematography techniques that she used to enhance the film's visual effects. Loïe designed her own lighting for the film and was among the very first filmmakers to ever use both slow motion as well as negative images. As historian Lynn Garafola wrote, Fuller was one of the first filmmakers to experiment with the new technique of slow motion for poetic ends, creating fleeting, dreamlike images that freed the medium from illusionism and imbued it with fantasy. Clearly an extension of her lifelong quest to experiment on the stage, Loïe's inquisitive and experimental spirit shone just as brightly on the screen. The film version of The Lily of Life premiered at the Gaumont Palace Theatre in Paris in February of 1921. Loïe was nervous that audiences might find her film too experimental for their liking. As she wrote in a letter to Queen Marie, "While the world is crying out for better films, the public are wanting the dime novels or serial stories of crime and adventure. So we are not sure we shall find the great market for a film such as ours. I will show it next week, with strings pulling at my heart, as they never did for anything else I have done." Fortunately for Loïe, her worst fears were never realized. The film was a massive hit with the public and received raving reviews from the press. As one review declared, "For the first time, a movie maker, Loïe Fuller, using all the resources appropriate to the new art, has constructed a film with almost no literary compromises, one in which the rhythmic movement of the characters and the skillful play of light and shadow suffice to create expression and emotion." Loïe and Gab went on to make 2 more films over the next few years, both of which were equally experimental. Of the 3 films, The Lily of Life was by far Loïe's most successful. But despite her triumphs, Loïe began to develop serious health issues as she aged, and she was once again forced to slow down. Most significantly, in 1923, Loïe discovered a large lump in her left breast, which became more and more painful as time went on. Unfortunately, when she went to have it checked out, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. As treatment, doctors recommended that she remove the tumor as well as lymph nodes in her armpits surgically. Loïe was terrified that the tumor might be fatal. As she later confided, "I was terribly disturbed, of course, and wondered how long I had to live." Fortunately, Loïe's operation was successful, and her doctors were confident that the cancer had been fully removed. Loïe spent the next several weeks recovering in bed, aided by her partner Gab and showered with flowers from her many friends and admirers. Because Loïe was now bedridden, she had to find new outlets for her creativity. It was during her recovery that Loïe took up painting, which she was able to do without straining her body. Loïe particularly enjoyed painting on silk fabric, and soon, painting would become more than just a way to pass the time. When one of Loïe's artist friends saw her paintings, he connected her to the director of the Louvre, who was so impressed with Loïe's work that he offered her a solo exhibition at the museum. We can only imagine how overjoyed Loïe must have been to be given the opportunity to exhibit her work at one of the most prestigious museums in the entire world. Once Loïe fully recovered, she organized a retrospective exhibition of 24 of her silk paintings, which would be shown alongside her original costume designs and photographs of her iconic performances. Loïe's retrospective at the Louvre officially opened in February of 1924 and served as a testament of her enduring influence on Paris's art world over the past 2 decades. The following year, Loïe shined once again when she participated in the 1925 International Decorative Arts Exposition. For the exposition, Loïe choreographed arguably her most ambitious performance to date. She hired 75 dancers to stand on the staircase of the Grand Palais. She then covered the entire staircase and each of these dancers with silk fabric. Then, while music began to play, Loïe projected green and blue lights onto the dancers as they moved their bodies rhythmically. The resulting effect turned the staircase of the Grand Palais into the sea, and the dancers into waves. Audiences were left in awe. One critic described her performance as an unforgettable experience, one of the most moving things my eyes have ever seen. Another declared, "Loïe Fuller has created a miracle." 25 years after her success at the Universal Exhibition, Loïe was once again at the heart of Paris's World Fair. As author Rhonda Gorelick wrote, "It was especially fitting that Fuller, the unofficial queen of that exposition 25 years earlier, should return to this World Fair site to mount the most spectacular production of her career, at the age of 63. But that age would soon catch up with her, and the 1925 exposition would be Loïe's last major success in her lifetime. Loïe spent the next and last 2 years of her life battling various different health issues. Though she still had great aspirations, such as writing her own autobiography, as well as opening a Loïe Fuller American Museum in Paris, Loïe often found herself too sick or exhausted to get anything done. As Loïe lamented in a letter, "I am so tired, so tired. All inside me is so tired, just tired out. Have you ever been so tired you could not even undress to go to bed? Well, I am just that way all the time. Isn't it dreadful? There is so much to do, so much that has to be done, and I put off because I am too tired. As I am writing this, my eyes close with almost each word I write." Eventually, Loïe became too ill to even leave her bed. She spent the last few months of her life confined to a small room at the Hotel Plaza Athénée, overlooking the Seine River. When Loïe developed pneumonia in December of 1927, it was clear that her end was imminent. In her final days, Loïe was visited by many of her students, who came to say their goodbyes to their great master. Loïe also received a heartfelt telegraph from the Queen of Romania, who upon hearing the news wrote to Loïe, "Goodbye, Loïe, la belle Loïe, be best, beloved." And of course, Loïe had her lifetime partner Gab by her side, who doted upon Loïe day and night. But just as the streets of Paris celebrated the new year, Loïe quietly slipped into a coma. She died just a few hours later in the early morning of January the 2nd, just days before her 66th birthday. What was Loïe thinking about as she took her final breaths? Was she filled with gratitude for the many years of success that she had enjoyed in Paris? Or was she consumed with regret for all of her projects and aspirations that she was unable to complete. As she saw the bright light welcoming her to the other side, did the magician of light feel like she was coming home. Loïe was given a small funeral on the morning of January 4th at the American Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. After the service, her coffin was carried to the Père Lachaise Cemetery, where Loïe was cremated as per her final wishes. As authors Richard and Marcia Current beautifully described, from the tall chimney of the crematorium rose whirling spirals of smoke that made one observer think of Loïe's whirling draperies of long ago. It was the last manifestation of the sublime dancer. Loïe's ashes were later placed in a special box at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, where they remain today. Gab, Loïe's faithful partner of over 30 years, devoted the rest of her life to preserving Loïe's legacy. Under Gab's direction, Loïe's School of Dance remained open, and her students continued to perform for another decade. As a contemporary critic noted, the famous creator of the serpentine, she who first had the idea that electricity could contribute to the dance, some time ago closed her eyes to that light of which she had demanded so much. But some devoted hands have preserved her legacy, and her pupils survive as priestesses of rhythm, light, and color. But sadly, despite Gab's best efforts, Loïe soon after fell into relative obscurity and has since remained largely forgotten. More recently, however, Loïe has started to receive the recognition she deserves. In 1975, on the 50th anniversary of Loïe's death, the Palace of the Legion of Honor Museum put on an exhibition titled In Celebration of Loïe Fuller, honoring Loïe's immense legacy and contributions to the museum's collection. In 1979, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts organized a major exhibition on Loïe titled Loïe Fuller, Magician of Light, which included over 100 different portraits of Loïe across various mediums. In 2012, the New York Public Library celebrated the sesquicentennial of Loïe's birth with a performance by Jody Sperling. In 2016, Stephanie DeGiusto directed a biopic based on Loïe's life titled The Dancer. In 2018, Taylor Swift dedicated a segment of her Reputation tour to Loïe, in which dancers recreated Loïe's famous serpentine dance. In 2023, a documentary titled Obsessed with Light was released, chronicling Loïe's life story and legacy. In 2024, Jody Sperling premiered Viva la Loïe, a performance dedicated to Loïe which recreated many of her dances. And visitors today can enjoy a permanent exhibition on Loïe at the Mary Hill Museum of Art. But in the words of author Rhonda Gorelick, given the degree of celebrity and wide sweep of artistic influence, one might have expected Loïe Fuller to remain in the cultural imagination long after her death. But this did not happen. Although Fuller would choreograph 128 dances and died a wildly famous woman, she quickly faded from popular consciousness. And as authors Richard and Marcia Current wrote, she was not only a pioneer of modern dance, but also an actress, an impresario, a playwright, a contributor to stage lighting and cinema techniques, a co-founder of 2 art museums, and the very personification of Art Nouveau. She was more than a dancer. Loïe deserves to be much better remembered than she has been. So in today's episode, we aim to honor Loïe's immense legacy as an avant-garde dancer, innovative inventor, champion of the arts, inspiring teacher, and political advocate, and as a woman who was unafraid to dance, quite literally, to the beat of her own drum. Of course, first and foremost, Loïe was a brilliant performer. Her dances themselves weren't complicated. Simple, sensuous movements as she wielded yards of fabric around her body to transform herself into abstract shapes. Yet despite their simplicity, Loïe's dances left audiences in awe. With her endless imagination, Loïe was able to tap in to humanity's desire for the fantastical. Her performances transported her audiences from the everyday world to mystical realms, where shapes and colors were as vibrant as the heavens themselves. Loïe invented an entirely new kind of sensory experience, and despite the steady stream of imposters throughout her career, Loïe was one of a kind. As author Rhonda Gorelick eloquently wrote, having never studied dance, she relied on simple steps of her own invention, designed to manipulate her enormous costumes. Routinely hidden by hundreds of yards of silk, Fuller manipulated her voluminous robes into swirling shapes above her head, transforming herself into lilies, butterflies, raging fires, even the surface of the moon. Audiences were left breathless. What so captivated them was the unique amalgam of Fuller's human agency, the creativity and force she exhibited as she wielded the enormous costumes, the power of her technology, the innovative stagecraft that she designed and patented herself, and the oniric, ephemeral landscapes evoked by this combination of body and machine. Which brings us to our next important point. Loïe's success as a performer was just as much due to her innovative stage and lighting techniques as it was her brilliance as a dancer. There is no denying that Loïe was an inventor, and her forward-thinking use of colored light and projected images not only turned her performances into visual sensations, but paved the way for the advancement of stage design. As the Professor Adeline Chevrier-Bassot wrote, "In the field of lighting and staging, Fuller left an indelible mark on the theater world. No technique existed at the time to provide the lighting effects she dreamed of, which led her to carry out her own research. Fuller became a light designer, set designer, chemist, costume maker, and stagehand, a true one-woman orchestra. Fuller controlled the creative and production process from start to finish." Dubbed the Magician of Light, Loïe brought life and movement to light, causing light to dance alongside her on stage. As author Rhonda Gorelick wrote, "Fuller created uncanny effects by breathing life into mechanical forms and playing with the distinction between light and shadows, bodies and prosthetics, reality and dreams. Like a painter on a canvas, Loïe blended light with color, movement, and music into three-dimensional compositions." The impact of Loïe's revolutionary performances was vast, and they not only left audiences wonderstruck, but greatly inspired the artists of her time. Loïe's presence can be seen in thousands of artworks from the turn of the century, whether literally in portraits or figuratively in the many works she inspired. She was subsequently and very appropriately dubbed the Queen of Art Nouveau. As author George Martin wrote, "So brilliant was she that she dazzled an entire epoch. There is not one modern style work from around 1900 that, in its waving curves, does not maintain a trace or a reflection of Loïe Fuller's dances." Loïe's image was immortalized on paper, bronze, ceramics, and Tiffany glass, making her one of the most depicted women of her time. But even in the works that don't feature her image, Loïe's exploration of color, sinuous movement, and natural form can certainly be felt. And Loïe's immense advocacy for the artists of her time also deserves equal recognition. Loïe fiercely fought for artists, most significantly the sculptor Auguste Rodin. It was largely thanks to Loïe's liaison that American institutions began collecting Rodin's work. Today, the San Francisco Legion of Honor Museum and the Mary Hill Museum have some of the most significant collections of Rodin's work in all of America, two museums that Loïe was heavily involved in establishing. And just as Loïe fought for the artists she loved, she also fought for a better world. Loïe went to great extents to advocate for Romania. spreading awareness and raising money for its relief. Of course, part of Loïe's advocacy may have been because of her growing feelings for the Queen. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship was, it's undeniably remarkable just how close a bond Loïe had with Queen Marie, and the impact Loïe had upon her reign. And while the nature of her relationship with Queen Marie remains unclear, her decades-long romance with her life partner, Gab Bloch, was not. Loïe was openly and unapologetically queer, in a time when that was almost unheard of. And what is even more remarkable is that Loïe managed to keep her relationship out of society's scorn. As author Rhonda Gorelick rightfully wrote, Loïe managed to be openly lesbian while evoking virtually no titillation or disapproval in the public. And more than this, the freedom with which she lived her life inspired a larger movement towards female liberation and empowerment. As Professor Adeline Chevrier-Bassot declared, Loïe Fuller was the embodiment of the social changes of her time. A queer artist, Fuller freed the female body from heteronormative representation and expression. She shared her life with a woman, and both were regulars in Parisian lesbian art circles. Her many references to flowers can also be read as various ways of expressing the artist's homosexuality, since flowers are associated with the female sex, both metaphorically and visually. But more than anything else, Loïe was a determined and fierce spirit, unafraid to dream big and break the mold on both an artistic and personal level. Though she may have unfairly faded into obscurity over time, today's episode stands as a reminder of Loïe Fuller's brilliance as a dancer, innovator, creative, and woman. We end today's episode with a quote from a letter that the Queen of Romania once wrote to Loïe. "One day, when your long struggle will be over, you will enter a light more marvelous than all the wonderful lights that you, light's great master, lit for us poor mortals, here on this suffering earth. It may not be in this world, but you will enjoy recognition. Our faithful Loïe." I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's two-part episode on the dancer and visionary Loïe Fuller. I have included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.